I had made her favorite poached salmon with lemon butter roasted carrots and a peach tart from scratch. I even found the old floral linen. She liked the one with the frayed edges she used to scold me about, but secretly adored. It was Margaret's 64th birthday, and I told myself this year might be different, not better maybe, but quieter. The table was set for 6. Margaret at the head, flanked by her bridge partner, Ellen, our cousin Diane, and 2 neighbors who had known me since I was a teenager. I poured the wine, offered smiles, passed dishes. It was almost easy to pretend this was love. Then Margaret raised her glass to aging without baggage, she said, smirking as she swirled the wine. And to finally having a life free of dead weight. She looked directly at me. Honestly, Valyria, the best gift you could give me is to leave my life. No one spoke. Ellen coughed softly. Diane's fork paused midair. I stared at Margaret, blinking once, then twice. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't want to hear it again. I stood slowly, excused myself with a smile that wasn't mine, and walked to the kitchen. I rinsed my hands under cool water until they numbed. Then I took my coat from the hook and left without saying goodbye. That night, I sat in the dim kitchen, still in my coat. The tart was untouched on the counter. The sink held empty glasses, wine-stained and half-rinsed. I looked at the chair where she had sat back straight, eyes smug, and wondered how long she had been rehearsing that sentence. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe it was instinct. I thought of all the birthdays before this, the ones I spent making hand-sewn gifts as a child, the years I decorated her front porch with candles. The decades of trying to earn something she never planned to give. I got up, placed the tart in the fridge, and stared at the dishes. I didn't clean them. I went to bed with the taste of silence in my mouth and her words ringing in my ears. The next morning, I opened my journal to a blank page. The page stayed blank for a long time. I held the pen but didn't write. My hand hovered over the paper like it was waiting for permission. And in the stillness of that morning, the memories came uninvited. I was 26 when I dropped out of grad school. Margaret had slipped on the ice outside her porch and fractured her hip. "You're all I have," she said over the phone, her voice thin and manipulative. I remember the way the professor's face fell when I told him I wouldn't be finishing the semester. "Just take a leave," he said gently. I nodded, but I never went back. I moved back into the house that week. It was supposed to be temporary. Years passed in increments. Appointments, medication, groceries, errands. I took a job at a local library. Flexible hours, close to home. I dated quietly, but never seriously. Every time someone asked about a future mine, I found a way to change the subject. When Margaret asked if she could freshen up the house, I agreed. She painted over the yellow hallway I loved and replaced the kitchen tiles with cold gray squares. "It's more modern," she said. I convinced myself it didn't matter. It was still home even if it didn't look like mine. I let her throw out the chair I bought during my first job. I laughed it off when she called it tacky. I said yes to every little no. That was our rhythm, she asked. I adjusted. But now in the quiet of this morning, it felt different. The pattern wasn't devotion. It was disappearance. A slow unraveling strand by strand until I couldn't tell where I ended and her expectations began. I lowered the pen and finally wrote something. I gave up so much trying not to make her feel alone, but I never asked if I was allowed to want more than surviving her. The ink bled into the page. I tore it out, folded it carefully, and tucked it in the back of the journal. Then I pulled open the filing drawer and began looking for my bank statements. I didn't sleep that night. My mind paced even when my body didn't move. I kept replaying all the moments I should have said something, drawn a line, made a choice that centered me instead of her. But I hadn't. I had waited for the situation to become unbearable before I dared to name it. In the morning, I made tea but didn't drink it. I sat at the kitchen table, opened a new journal, and wrote the sentence as if it had been waiting years to exist. I have been edited out of my own life. The words landed harder on paper than they did in my chest. I read them twice, then underlined them once. Then I began. I made a list of everything Margaret had access to. Joint accounts, the house deed, my password scribbled on that kitchen notepad. She always pretended not to notice. I circled the things that needed to change first. Next, I gathered all the paperwork I could find: insurance forms, bank statements, the will I had signed without reading years ago. I called the bank and scheduled an appointment to remove her as an authorized user. I searched for legal referrals and found a small law office 2 towns over. The lawyer's name was Michael Carter. I liked the sound of it, firm, not flashy. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not Diane, not my neighbor. Certainly not Margaret. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even anger. It was air. After holding my breath for over a decade that afternoon, I stood in the hallway and looked around the house, not with sentiment, but with precision. What was mine? What had been given and what had been taken without consent, my eyes landed on the old oak desk near the window. It was the last thing my father had touched before he died. I opened the drawer and pulled out the small envelope where he used to keep emergency cash. It was empty. The next day I drove to meet the lawyer. Margaret noticed. Not right away, but soon enough. I stopped reminding her about appointments. I no longer filled in the silences with polite conversation. I cooked only for myself, using the small pan instead of the big one we used to share. She began hovering again, offering half-sincere smiles, commenting on my clothes like she was trying to sound maternal. One morning, she tapped on my door with a tray of burnt toast and oversteeped tea. "I figured you'd be tired," she said gently. "We haven't talked much since." "Well, you know..." She waved a hand vaguely, pretending not to remember the words she had etched into the center of my chest. "You mean your birthday?" I asked. She blinked. "That." "Oh, come on, Valyria. It was a joke. I was tipsy. People say things." I nodded but didn't let her in. Later that week, I sat across from a bank manager as she pulled up my account history. I watched her face change with each line she scrolled through. "Someone's been transferring funds regularly to another checking account," she said. "They're small amounts but consistent. Over $6,000 this past year." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I already knew. That evening, I found Margaret folding towels in the laundry room. She looked up with that tired expression she wore like armor. I saw the withdrawals. I said. She straightened. "What are you talking about, my account?" "Thousands taken without asking." Margaret sighed and dropped a towel into the basket. "You're overreacting. It was for things we needed: repairs, prescriptions, your car maintenance." "You never asked." "You wouldn't have minded." She snapped. "You always said we're in this together." "God, Valyria, you're being so selfish." I stared at her. "Selfish?" I repeated. "Yes," she said, her voice rising. "You act like you're owed something just for living here." I didn't reply. I walked past her up the stairs and into my room. I locked the door behind me, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to explain the boundary out loud. The next morning, I found a letter in the mailbox without a return address. The envelope was plain, the paper thick, folded neatly in thirds. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting before I opened it: neat, slightly slanted, written with care. Mrs. Harper lived 2 doors down. We'd spoken maybe a dozen times in 15 years. She always waved from her porch, but never lingered. "Dear Valyria, I hope you don't mind the letter. I don't want to intrude, but I've watched from my window for a long time. Not to be nosy, just to bear witness. I've seen what you've carried, what you've given, the way you disappear to make others more comfortable. You are not invisible, Valyria. And you are not wrong." With quiet admiration, Susan Harper, I read it twice then once more, just to feel the words again. My eyes stung, not from pain, but from the foreign comfort of being seen without having to explain myself. I folded the letter along its original crease and slipped it into the back pocket of my journal next to the torn page I had written after the birthday. It didn't fix anything, but it steadied something in me that had been wobbling for years. That evening, I made dinner just for myself and didn't offer to share. Margaret didn't ask. When the dishes were done, I opened my laptop and searched for a notary near the county clerk's office. I had already called Michael Carter. The next step would be signing the documents. I checked the locks before I went to bed, then placed the journal on the nightstand where I could see it. The next morning, I dressed in quiet clothes and drove to the attorney's office. Michael was calm, measured, and precise. His office smelled faintly of cedar, and the walls were lined with certificates I didn't need to read. I trusted him the moment he said, "You don't need a war. You need a boundary that holds." We spent the better part of an hour signing papers. He walked me through every step, freezing joint accounts, updating the deed, revising my will. At the end, he slid the final form toward me. I hesitated only briefly before signing. Outside, the wind had picked up. By the time I got home, the first drops of rain had started. Margaret was in the kitchen. She looked up from her crossword. "Where have you been out?" Her eyes narrowed. "You've been distant lately and secretive. I don't like it." I said nothing. I went upstairs. That night, the storm came not from the sky, but through the phone. It started with a voicemail from Cousin Sarah. "What's going on over there?" your mom called. "Said you're freezing her out." "That's cruel, Valyria." Then came the texts from old neighbors, the passive-aggressive ones just checking in, heard some worrying things. And then Diane, who didn't bother sugarcoating it. "I can't believe you do this to her after everything she's done for you." I turned my phone face down and let it buzz itself into silence. Downstairs, doors slammed harder than they needed to. Cabinet drawers opened and shut with sharp intent. Margaret moved through the house with heavy footsteps, as if sound alone could carry her blame up the stairs. I stayed in my room and wrote it all down. I am not punishing her. I am reclaiming what is mine. The next morning, Margaret banged on my door. "You've made your point," she snapped. "Now undo it." I opened the door just enough to speak. "It's not a game, Margaret. There's nothing to undo." She stared at me incredulous. "You'll regret this." Maybe I said, but at least this regret will be mine. I shut the door and locked it. 2 days later, a notice was delivered to the house official, notarized and irreversible. By the end of the week, Margaret was gone. She didn't say goodbye. I heard her dragging luggage across the hardwood floor just after dawn. Her voice, sharp and muttering, carried through the walls as she called someone to pick her up. A car idled out front for 10 minutes. Then the door slammed and I heard nothing else. I waited an hour before coming downstairs. The living room was still. A few picture frames were missing, some drawers left open, but the bones of the house had stayed. My house, my name on the deed, now uncontested. The quiet pressed in, but this time it didn't feel like accusation. It felt like breath, like space. I started slowly. The painting of the wildflowers I'd tucked away 5 years ago. I hung it back above the fireplace. I changed the bulbs in the hallway to warm light. I brought my grandmother's quilt down from the attic and spread it over the couch, the blue and green stitching still soft under my palms. I opened every window in the house. Let the air move through each room until it carried her scent away. Later that evening, I found an old tea tin at the back of the cupboard, the one I used to keep tucked in my nightstand drawer before Margaret declared it clutter. I brewed a cup and drank it on the back porch, legs tucked under me, the sun slipping behind the trees. I thought I might cry, but I didn't. Not then. Instead, I sat with a calm so quiet I almost didn't recognize it. Not relief, not victory. Something else, something like return. That night, I slept with the bedroom door open. The next morning, I registered for an art class at the community center. The room smelled faintly of pencil shavings, and turpentine warm lived in without expectation. No one asked me why I was there. No one asked my last name. I found a seat near the back, opened my sketchbook, and waited. The instructor, a woman named Rachel with silver-streaked curls and paint on her sleeves, welcomed everyone without fanfare. "We're not here to be good," she said. "We're here to begin." I hadn't drawn since I was 22. Not really. Not since I left school and tucked that part of myself away like a luxury I couldn't afford. The first few lines were hesitant, my hand stiff and unfamiliar with movement that once felt instinctive. But by the second class, something shifted. I wasn't drawing to be seen. I was drawing because it felt like breathing again. No one in the room knew about Margaret. No one knew about the bank accounts or the slammed doors or the birthday toast that had cracked something open. They only knew the way I shaded light, the way I smudged with the side of my thumb, the way I laughed softly. Surprised when someone told a joke under their breath. It was enough. Each week I came home with charcoal under my nails and a sense of stillness I didn't try to explain. I began rearranging the house one corner at a time. I painted the guest bathroom a pale sage. I moved the reading lamp to the other side of the couch. I filled frames with my own sketches, quiet portraits of Hans trees, and once a single daisy. One afternoon, I found myself humming while cooking. It startled me. I hadn't made noise just to fill space in years. That evening, I sat by the window with my journal and wrote one sentence. I'm not building a new life. I'm remembering the one I left behind. And then the phone rang. It was her voice, hollowed out but unmistakable. Valyria, she said barely above a whisper. It's me. I didn't say anything. The phone sat warm in my hand, balanced between memory and instinct. I'm not well, she continued. The doctors found something, and I thought you should know. I let the silence stretch. She sighed. The kids ask about you. They miss you. We all do. It was the word we that struck hardest. I could picture her saying it, her hand on her chest, like it justified everything that came before. I'm sorry, she added softer now. I said things I didn't mean. But this house doesn't feel right without you. None of it does. I looked out the window where the daisy sketch now hung in the corner of the glass. The light hit it differently every hour. It had become a kind of clock for me, marking time by how it changed. I'm glad the kids are well, I said, and I hope you're getting the care you need. She paused. So, can we talk? Maybe come by just to see you. I closed my eyes. I can't go back to being small so you can feel big, I said quietly. She exhaled sharply, wounded or angry. I couldn't tell which. So that's it. That's it? She hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just sat there breathing. The quiet didn't feel like punishment anymore. The next morning, I stepped out into the garden with a trowel in one hand and a packet of seeds in the other. The soil was dry but soft, the kind that welcomed change. I pressed the lavender seedlings into the earth, gently spacing them with care, then followed with sage along the back edge of the fence. I didn't rush. Each handful of dirt felt like a promise. When I stood to stretch my back, the sun was low and warm across the porch. A breeze moved through the branches, and for the first time in years, I could hear the world without a filter of tension. I stayed out there until the light shifted to gold. Then came the knock. 2 girls stood at my front steps, maybe 7 or 8, their faces open and curious. One held a basket lined with a kitchen towel. Hi, the taller one said. These are from my mom. The younger nudged her and added, She says your garden makes her feel brave. I blinked, caught off guard. Well, that's very kind, I said, crouching to their level. Tell her I said thank you. They smiled and ran off before I could say more, their laughter trailing behind them like ribbon. I carried the basket inside and set it on the kitchen table. Still warm, the muffins smelled like cinnamon and apple. I didn't eat one right away. I just stood there, letting the quiet stretch wide around me. Later, I lit a candle in the living room and opened my journal. I thought disappearing would break me, I wrote. But maybe I was never meant to be seen by them. Maybe I was meant to see myself. The candle flickered, casting a soft halo of light over the pages. And then I turned to a fresh sheet and began to draw. Valyria learns the profound lesson of reclaiming her own identity and agency after years of self-erasure to appease her mother, Margaret. Through the painful catalyst of Margaret's cruel birthday toast, Valyria recognizes how her sacrifices abandoning grad school surrendering personal choices, and allowing financial exploitation diminished her sense of self. By setting boundaries, reclaiming her home, and rediscovering her passion for art, she realizes that her worth isn't tied to others' approval. Valyria's journey teaches her that true fulfillment comes from honoring her own needs and desires, not disappearing to make others comfortable, embracing a life authentically hers.
The mahogany conference table in Attorney Morrison's office gleamed under the afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat in the corner chair, wearing a simple black dress and cardigan, watching my family gather around the polished surface like vultures circling a fresh carcass. Dad had been gone for 2 weeks, and the grief in the room was already being overshadowed by anticipatory greed. My brother Carlos adjusted his expensive suit and cleared his throat importantly. At 35, he'd cultivated the appearance of success with his luxury car lease, designer clothes, and frequent social media posts from upscale restaurants. He worked as a regional sales manager for a mid-tier software company, making decent money but spending far beyond his means to maintain an image of prosperity. "Before we begin," Carlos announced to the room, "I think we all know how this is going to go. As the eldest son and Dad's business partner, I'm the rightful heir to everything. The construction company, the properties, the investments, they'll all transfer to me as the natural successor." My sister Maria nodded approvingly from across the table. She dressed for the occasion in a black Chanel suit that she'd probably bought specifically for today, anticipating her inheritance windfall. Maria worked as a marketing director for a cosmetics company, earning a comfortable salary that she supplemented with credit card debt to fund her lifestyle in the city's trendy neighborhood. "Carlos has been working with Dad on the business for years," Maria added, shooting me a dismissive glance. "It only makes sense that he'd inherit the family assets. Some of us have been building careers while others have been." She gestured vaguely in my direction. "Well, doing whatever it is you do, Isabella." Uncle Roberto and Aunt Carmen murmured their agreement. They'd driven down from Sacramento for the reading, already making plans for how Carlos would manage the family construction business that Dad had built over 30 years. The company specialized in commercial projects, office buildings, retail centers, apartment complexes, and had generated steady income for decades. "Rodriguez Construction has been in the family for 3 generations," Uncle Roberto said proudly. "It's only right that it stays with the son who understands the business." I remained silent in my corner, smoothing down my simple dress and listening to my family discuss my father's legacy as if I weren't in the room. They saw what they'd always seen: the youngest daughter who'd never married, never had children, never achieved the traditional markers of success that mattered to them. At 32, I lived in a modest apartment, drove a reliable but unremarkable Toyota, and worked what they assumed was some kind of low-level office job that I rarely discussed. What they didn't know was that I'd been quietly managing more of Dad's affairs than anyone realized. Attorney Morrison entered the room carrying a thick leather portfolio and a grave expression. He'd been the family lawyer for over 20 years, handling everything from Dad's business contracts to Maria's divorce proceedings. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the kind of precise demeanor that comes from decades of delivering life-changing news to families in crisis. "Thank you all for coming," Morrison said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, and I'll try to make this process as straightforward as possible." Carlos leaned forward eagerly. "We appreciate that, Mr. Morrison. I think we're all prepared for what's coming. Dad and I discussed his wishes many times over the years." "Indeed," Morrison replied carefully. "Your father was very thorough in his estate planning. However, there are some elements of his arrangements that may surprise you." He opened the portfolio and removed several documents, arranging them methodically on the table. "Let me begin with the family construction business, Rodriguez Construction LLC. "That comes to me obviously," Carlos interrupted. "I've been Dad's partner for the past 8 years. I know every contract, every client relationship, every aspect of the operation." Morrison looked at Carlos with the patient expression of someone who'd dealt with presumptuous heirs before. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm afraid that's not accurate. Rodriguez Construction was transferred to Isabella Rodriguez 3 years ago, along with all associated assets, properties, and contractual obligations." The room fell completely silent. Carlos blinked rapidly as if he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Your sister Isabella has been the sole owner and operator of Rodriguez Construction since January 2021, when she assumed all business debts and obligations in exchange for full ownership transfer. Maria's mouth dropped open. That's impossible. Isabella doesn't know anything about construction. She works some little office job downtown. Actually, Morrison continued, consulting his documents, Ms. Rodriguez has been managing the company's operations, client relationships and financial obligations for the past 3 years. Under her leadership, the company has expanded significantly, taking on larger projects and increasing annual revenue by approximately 340%. I finally spoke up from my corner. The little office job is overseeing 12 construction crews, managing $47 million in active contracts and coordinating projects across 3 counties. My family stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. But how? Carlos stammered. I've been going to the office every day, meeting with clients, supervising projects. You've been handling day-to-day operational tasks as a site manager, I said gently. I've been running the business. The client meetings you've attended? I arranged them. The projects you've supervised? I negotiated the contracts. The paychecks you've received? I've been signing them. Morrison nodded. Ms. Rodriguez has been the company's CEO and primary decision-maker for 3 years. Your father made this arrangement when the business faced significant financial difficulties, and Isabella stepped in to prevent bankruptcy. Uncle Roberto was shaking his head in disbelief. This doesn't make sense. Isabella's never shown any interest in the construction business. She barely comes to family gatherings. I've been working 60-hour weeks for the past 3 years, I replied. Family gatherings became a luxury I couldn't afford while I was rebuilding the company Dad nearly lost. Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps I should explain the circumstances that led to this arrangement. In late 2020, Rodriguez Construction was facing severe financial difficulties. Several large clients had defaulted on payments. The company owed approximately $2.3 million to suppliers and subcontractors, and there were pending lawsuits that threatened to force bankruptcy. Carlos looked pale. I knew we had some cash flow problems, but I didn't realize. Your father was protecting you from the full extent of the crisis, Morrison continued. He didn't want to burden you with problems he felt responsible for creating. Instead, he approached Isabella, who had been quietly observing the business's challenges and had developed a comprehensive recovery plan. Recovery plan? Maria echoed. Isabella doesn't have business training. She doesn't have access to millions of dollars. How could she possibly save a failing construction company? Morrison smiled slightly. As it turns out, Ms. Rodriguez had both the expertise and the resources necessary to turn the company around. She'd been working as a senior project manager for Meridian Development Group, one of the largest commercial real estate firms on the West Coast. I watched my family's faces as they processed this information. They'd assumed my reluctance to discuss work in detail meant I had an unimpressive job, when in reality I'd been protecting client confidentiality and managing projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Meridian Development? Uncle Roberto repeated. They handle some of the biggest construction projects in the state. They do, I confirmed. I'd been working there for 6 years, managing everything from shopping center developments to high-rise office buildings. When Dad's company got into trouble, I had the industry connections and financial resources to step in. Morrison consulted another document. Ms. Rodriguez used her personal savings and investment portfolio to pay off all company debts, totaling $2.3 million. In exchange, your father transferred complete ownership of Rodriguez Construction to her, along with all properties, equipment, and future earnings. Investment portfolio? Carlos asked weakly. I'd been investing systematically since college, I explained. Living below my means, putting money into diversified accounts, building wealth quietly while everyone assumed I was struggling financially. Morrison nodded. The arrangement has proven extremely beneficial for all parties. Ms. Rodriguez transformed Rodriguez Construction from a failing local business into one of the region's most successful commercial contractors. Current annual revenue exceeds $23 million, with projects scheduled through 2026. Maria was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. Isabella, you're saying you've been running a multi-million-dollar construction company for 3 years and we had no idea? You had no idea because you never asked what I was actually doing, I replied. You saw that I lived modestly and worked long hours, and you assumed that meant I was unsuccessful. But why didn't Dad tell us? Carlos demanded. Why let me think I was going to inherit the business when you'd already taken it over? Morrison looked uncomfortable. Your father struggled with that decision. He was proud of Isabella's success but worried about family dynamics. He hoped that over time the situation would become apparent naturally. He was protecting your feelings, I added. Dad knew you'd invested your identity in being his business successor. He didn't want to hurt you by making the transition public until it was absolutely necessary. Aunt Carmen had been silent throughout the revelations, but now she spoke up. Isabella, if you own the construction company, what happens to the rest of us? Carlos has been depending on his salary and we all expected. Everyone who's been working for the company will continue working for the company, I said. Carlos, your position is secure, and your salary will actually increase now that we're more profitable. The only thing that changes is official recognition of what's been true for 3 years. Morrison continued with the rest of the will reading. Dad's personal assets, his house, his car, his savings accounts, were divided among his children according to a traditional structure. But the business, which represented the bulk of his wealth, had already been transferred years earlier. There's one more element to discuss, Morrison said, removing a sealed envelope from his portfolio. Your father left individual letters for each of you, to be opened after the will reading. He handed me mine and I opened it with trembling fingers. My dearest Isabella, Dad had written in his careful handwriting. By now you know that everyone understands what you've accomplished. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to tell them sooner. You saved our family's legacy, and you did it with grace and humility that made me proud every day. I know Carlos and Maria will be shocked, but I hope they'll also be grateful. You've given them security they wouldn't have had otherwise. Take care of our family business, but more importantly, take care of our family. Love, Papa. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter carefully. Carlos was reading his own letter, his expressions cycling through confusion, understanding, and something that looked like relief. Dad says he was worried about my reaction, but that he hoped I'd be proud to work for my brilliant sister. Maria's letter apparently contained similar sentiments, because she was looking at me with new eyes. Isabella, I owe you an apology. We've been treating you like the family failure when you were actually the one holding everything together. You weren't trying to hurt me, I said. You were working with incomplete information. But why did you let us think you were struggling? Carlos asked. Why not tell us what you were really doing? Because the business recovery required my complete focus, I explained. I couldn't afford to spend time managing family expectations or dealing with questions about decisions I needed to make quickly. Your assumptions about my situation gave me the freedom to work without interference. Uncle Roberto was shaking his head slowly. Isabella, how much is the company worth now? Based on current contracts and projected earnings, approximately $15 million, I said. We're also in negotiations for several major projects that could increase that valuation significantly. $15 million, Maria repeated faintly. And you built that while we thought you were barely getting by. Morrison began packing up his documents. If there are no further questions about the estate arrangements, I think we've covered everything. Isabella, you'll need to sign some additional paperwork to formalize the transition from your father's name to yours on certain accounts, but the substantive work was completed years ago. As the family began to file out of the conference room, Carlos approached me hesitantly. Isabella, I need to ask you something. When I've been working on projects, giving directions to crews, making decisions about materials and schedules, was I actually in charge, or were you managing everything behind the scenes? You were in charge of day-to-day operations, I said diplomatically. But yes, I was making the strategic decisions, approving major expenditures and handling client relationships. You're good at what you do, Carlos. You just weren't doing what you thought you were doing. He laughed, but it sounded more relieved than bitter. So I've been a middle manager who thought he was a CEO. You've been a valuable employee who helped save the family business, I corrected. There's no shame in that. Maria joined our conversation. Isabella, I have to ask, how does it feel to know that we've been patronizing you for years while you were secretly more successful than any of us? I considered the question carefully. It feels like justice, but not the vindictive kind. It feels like truth finally being acknowledged. And what happens now? Carlos asked. Now we move forward as a family that actually knows each other, I said. You can keep doing the work you're good at, but with better understanding of how your role fits into the bigger picture. Maria, your marketing experience could actually be valuable for expanding our client base. And Uncle Roberto, your connections in Sacramento could help us bid on state projects. 6 months later, I was standing in the conference room of our new corporate headquarters, looking out at the bustling construction site where our crews were building a 12-story office complex. Rodriguez Construction had officially rebranded as Rodriguez Development Group, reflecting our expansion into full-service commercial real estate development. Carlos had embraced his role as operations manager, and his performance had improved dramatically once he understood the company's actual scope and his place within it. Maria had taken a part-time consulting position with us, helping develop marketing strategies for attracting higher-value clients. Even Uncle Roberto had become involved, using his Sacramento connections to secure 3 significant state contracts. My phone buzzed with a text from Carlos. Just closed the Riverside project. $3.2 million contract, 18-month timeline. Thanks for teaching me how to negotiate properly. I smiled and replied, thanks for being willing to learn. The family that had once dismissed me as the unsuccessful younger sister now understood that I'd been quietly building something extraordinary while they'd focused on appearances and assumptions. More importantly, they'd moved beyond their initial shock to become genuinely supportive of what we were accomplishing together. That evening we held our monthly family dinner at the restaurant where we'd gathered after Dad's funeral. The atmosphere was completely different now. Instead of patronizing concern for my future, there was genuine interest in the business developments and mutual respect for each other's contributions. Isabella, Aunt Carmen said as we looked over the dessert menu, I need to apologize for all those years of treating you like you needed our guidance and protection. You were trying to be helpful based on what you could see, I replied. I don't hold that against anyone. But we were so wrong about everything, Maria said. We thought you were the one who needed help when you were actually the one helping all of us. Carlos raised his wine glass. To Isabella, who saved our family's legacy while we were too busy making assumptions to notice what she was actually accomplishing. To family, I replied, and to the difference between what we think we see and what's actually happening. My family had spent years telling me what my future should look like, never bothering to discover what I was building in the present. Now they knew the difference between assumptions and reality. And so did I. The argument started like most of our arguments with my sister Jessica announcing another milestone in her corporate career. She'd just been promoted to senior marketing director at Morrison & Associates, complete with a corner office, company car and $120,000 salary. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart, Mom gushed, refilling Jessica's wine glass. A corner office at 28. Your father and I always knew you'd be successful. Dad nodded approvingly from the head of the dining room table. That's what happens when you make smart career choices. Stable company, good benefits, real growth potential. I continued eating my dinner quietly, used to being the invisible third wheel at these family celebrations. At 31, I was the disappointing older brother who still lived at home, who spent his days playing on computers, instead of getting a real job. And the best part, Jessica continued, is that Morrison & Associates is expanding into digital marketing. They're looking to acquire some of these little tech startups to boost their capabilities. Easy pickings, really. Most of these garage operations don't understand real business. That's when Dad turned his attention to me. Speaking of which, Michael, how's your little computer project going? Still losing money? I looked up from my plate. It's going well, actually. We just completed beta testing and we're ready to launch. Launch what exactly? Mom asked with that tone she used when talking to children about their imaginary friends. Remind us what this business of yours actually does. We've developed an AI-powered customer service platform that can handle complex inquiries across multiple languages and integrate with existing business systems. The beta results showed 300% improvement in response times and 95% customer satisfaction rates. Jessica laughed. Michael, that sounds like nonsense you made up. AI customer service? Everyone knows those chatbots are terrible. No real company would use that. Actually, several Fortune 500 companies have already expressed interest after seeing our beta results. Which companies? Dad interrupted, his voice taking on that familiar skeptical edge. I hesitated. The NDAs I'd signed with potential clients prevented me from naming them, but I couldn't explain that without sounding like I was making excuses. I can't disclose that information due to confidentiality agreements. Dad slammed his hand on the table. Of course you can't. Because they don't exist. Michael, you've been living in this house for 3 years, spending all day in that room with your computers, burning through what little savings you had, and you have nothing to show for it. Dad, that's not true. The company is valued at. Valued by who? Jessica interjected. Some imaginary investors? Michael, I work in marketing. I understand business. What you're describing isn't a real company. It's a hobby that's gotten out of control. Mom reached across the table and patted my hand condescendingly. Honey, we love that you're creative and interested in technology. But at some point you need to face reality. You're 31 years old. Most people your age have careers, mortgages, families. You can't keep pretending that playing with computers is going to make you rich. This isn't playing with computers, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Innovate Tech Solutions has been in development for 3 years. We have proprietary algorithms, patent applications, and genuine interest from major corporations. Dad's face was getting red now, the way it did when he was building up to one of his explosive outbursts. Innovate Tech Solutions? You gave your pretend company a name? Michael, listen to yourself. You sound like a child playing make-believe. The technology we've developed could revolutionize customer service across multiple industries. Stop. Dad shouted, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Just stop with this fantasy. You don't have a company. You don't have employees. You don't have customers. You have a laptop and a bunch of code that nobody wants. Richard, please, Mom said, though her tone suggested she agreed with him. Let's discuss this calmly. No, Linda. I'm tired of discussing this calmly. I'm tired of watching our son waste his life on this delusion. Michael, you're embarrassing yourself and embarrassing this family. Jessica leaned back in her chair, watching the argument with obvious satisfaction. She'd always enjoyed these moments when I was the target of Dad's disapproval instead of her. Dad, if you just let me show you the beta test results. I don't want to see your fake test results. I want to see you get a real job. Apply to real companies. Morrison and Associates is hiring in their IT department. Jessica could put in a word for you. I don't want to work in IT support, I said quietly. You don't want to work at all. Dad exploded. That's the problem. You want to sit in your room playing video games and pretending you're some tech entrepreneur. I'm not playing video games. I'm running a business. You're running nothing. You have nothing. You are nothing but a 31-year-old failure living in his parents' house. The words hit like a physical blow. I'd heard Dad's criticism for 3 years, but he'd never been quite that brutal before. Richard, Mom said weakly, that was harsh. It's honest, Jessica said, emboldened by Dad's outburst. Michael, you need to hear this. You're not an entrepreneur. You're not a CEO. You're an unemployed adult living at home and pretending that amateur programming is a career. I stood up slowly, my dinner half finished. I understand you don't believe in what I'm doing. There's nothing to believe in. Dad screamed. Take your failure business and get out. I'm done supporting this nonsense. You have 1 week to find a real job and start paying rent, or you can take your laptops and your pretend company and find somewhere else to live. The dining room fell silent except for the ticking of Mom's antique clock on the mantel. Jessica was staring at her wine glass, probably regretting that Dad had escalated things quite this far. Mom was looking back and forth between Dad and me, clearly torn between keeping the peace and supporting her husband. Fine, I said quietly. I'll pack tonight. Michael, Mom started, your father didn't mean. Yes, I did, Dad interrupted. I absolutely meant it. I'm not enabling this fantasy for another day. I walked upstairs to my room, the same room I'd lived in through high school, college, and now for 3 years while building Innovate Tech Solutions. The walls were still decorated with posters from my teenage years, making the whole situation feel even more pathetic from the outside. But those posters were looking down on something Dad and Jessica couldn't see. A sophisticated development setup with 3 high-end monitors, server equipment humming quietly in the corner, and whiteboards covered with algorithms and business projections that represented 3 years of 18-hour days. I started packing methodically. Laptop, external drives, development notes, legal documents, patent applications. Everything that mattered for the business fit into 2 large suitcases and a backpack. Everything that represented my actual life's work for the past 3 years. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Kim, my co-founder and CTO, who'd been working remotely from San Francisco. Final contracts came through. Tech Global signed this afternoon. $2.3 billion acquisition closes Friday. We did it, man. We actually did it. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Perfect timing. I'll call you in an hour." I finished packing in silence, listening to the muffled conversation downstairs where my family was probably discussing how they'd handled the Michael situation. I could imagine Jessica explaining to Mom how this was really for the best, how I needed tough love to face reality. As I carried my bags downstairs, Dad was waiting in the living room with his arms crossed. "I hope you understand this is for your own good," he said. "Sometimes people need to hit rock bottom before they make real changes." "I understand," I replied, hefting my laptop bag over my shoulder. "Where will you go?" "I'll figure it out." Mom appeared from the kitchen, wringing her hands. "Michael, honey, maybe we can work something out. If you promise to start looking for real jobs." "It's okay, Mom. Dad's right. It's time for me to move on." Jessica emerged from the dining room, probably feeling guilty about how the evening had unfolded. "Michael, look, maybe I was too harsh. I could talk to some people at Morrison & Associates. There might be opportunities in our tech consulting division." "Thanks, but I'll be fine." I walked to the front door, then turned back one last time. "For what it's worth, I love you all. And I hope someday you'll understand that I wasn't pretending." Dad's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "I hope someday you'll thank us for this." I drove to a hotel downtown, checked into a suite, and immediately called Marcus. "Dude, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours. Tech Global wants to announce the acquisition Monday morning. Their PR team needs our approval on the press release. Send it to me. I'll review everything tonight." "Are you okay? You sound weird." "Just had an interesting conversation with my family. They kicked me out for running a failure business." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "They kicked you out? Tonight? 3 days before we become billionaires. They don't know about the acquisition. As far as they're concerned, I'm a 31-year-old loser who plays with computers in his childhood bedroom." "Jesus, Michael. That's brutal." "It's actually perfect timing. I was getting tired of pretending to be unsuccessful." Over the next 3 days, I worked with Marcus and our legal team to finalize every detail of the acquisition. Tech Global Corporation, the largest customer service software company in North America, was acquiring Innovate Tech Solutions for $2.3 billion in cash and stock. Marcus and I, as co-founders, would each walk away with $1.1 billion after taxes and employee payouts. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years I'd been living at home not because I couldn't afford my own place, but because I was reinvesting every dollar back into the company. My failure lifestyle had been a choice. I'd been living like a broke college student while building technology that was about to make me one of the youngest billionaires in the state. Friday morning, I was in Tech Global's corporate headquarters signing the final paperwork when my phone started buzzing with calls from home. The press release had gone out at 9 a.m. Eastern, and apparently the local news had picked up the story. I let the calls go to voicemail and focused on the closing documents. By noon it was official. Innovate Tech Solutions had been acquired for the largest tech deal in state history. That evening I was back in my hotel suite, reviewing job offers from 3 different Silicon Valley companies who wanted me to lead their AI development teams, when there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Mom, Dad, and Jessica standing in the hallway looking like they'd seen a ghost. "Michael," Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We saw the news." "What news?" I asked, though I knew exactly what they meant. Dad cleared his throat. "The news about your company being sold. For $2.3 billion. "Oh, that." I stepped aside to let them into the suite. "Yeah, the acquisition closed this afternoon." They filed in slowly, taking in the luxury hotel suite with its panoramic city views and premium furnishings. Jessica was staring at everything like she was in a museum. "Michael," Dad said, sitting heavily on the couch, "I don't understand. The news said you're the co-founder and CEO of Innovate Tech Solutions." "That's correct. But how is that possible? You were living in your childhood bedroom. You didn't have an office, employees, revenue." Actually, I had all of those things. I just didn't have them in ways you could see. I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation I'd shown to investors 6 months earlier. Innovate Tech Solutions has been operating for 3 years. We have 12 full-time employees working remotely across 4 countries. Our beta clients include 6 Fortune 500 companies. Our AI platform processes over 50 million customer service interactions per month. Mom was staring at the screen like it was written in a foreign language. But you never told us any of this. I tried to tell you. Every time I mentioned the company, you dismissed it as playing with computers. Every time I tried to explain what we were building, you told me to get a real job. Jessica leaned forward. But Michael, you were living at home. If your company was so successful, why didn't you have your own place? Because I was reinvesting everything back into the company. My living expenses were essentially zero, which meant every dollar of revenue could go toward development, equipment, and hiring the best talent. You mean you chose to live at home? Dad asked, his voice hollow. I chose to bootstrap the company instead of taking venture capital funding. Living at home was part of that strategy. It let us maintain complete control over our technology and our vision. I pulled up another slide showing our revenue growth. We've been profitable for 18 months. Last quarter, we generated $47 million in revenue.
The room was completely silent. So when you said you had confidentiality agreements with Fortune 500 companies, Mom started. I meant actual legal agreements with actual corporations. Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, Salesforce, Oracle, and Cisco have all been beta testing our platform. Jessica's face had gone completely pale. The customer service AI you described at dinner is currently handling customer inquiries for some of the largest companies in the world. The 300% improvement in response times wasn't a projection, it was actual measured results from live deployments. Dad put his head in his hands. Michael, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. How could you have known? You never asked to see what I was actually working on. You just assumed that because I was living at home and working on computers, I must be failing. But the way you dressed, the car you drove, the fact that you never seemed to have money. Mom said, I drove a 2015 Honda Civic because it was reliable and economical. I dressed casually because I worked from home. And I didn't spend money on things because I was focused on building something bigger. I closed the laptop and looked at each of them. For 3 years, you've been embarrassed by me. You've introduced me to people as your son who does something with computers. You've suggested I needed to grow up, get serious, face reality. We thought we were helping, Dad said quietly. You thought I was a failure. And rather than trying to understand what I was actually doing, you decided I needed to be fixed. Jessica finally found her voice. Michael, we made a terrible mistake. We judged you based on appearances instead of results. You judged me based on your own limited understanding of what success looks like. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Do you know what the hardest part was? It wasn't the 18-hour days or the technical challenges or the stress of building a company. It was coming home every night to a family that treated me like I was wasting my life. How can we make this right? Mom asked, tears in her eyes. I turned back to face them. You can start by understanding that success doesn't always look the way you expect it to. You can stop assuming that because someone's path is different from yours, it must be wrong. Dad stood up slowly. Michael, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I called your life's work a failure. I called you a failure. I was completely wrong about everything. You were wrong about the facts, but you weren't wrong to be concerned. If I had actually been a 31-year-old playing video games in his parents' house, your intervention would have been appropriate. But you weren't playing video games, Jessica said. You were building a billion-dollar company. I was building something I believed in, something that could make a real difference in how businesses interact with their customers. The $1 billion is just how the market valued that vision. Mom wiped her eyes. What happens now? Do you move to Silicon Valley? Do you start another company? I'm not sure yet. Tech Global wants me to stay on and lead their AI division. I've got offers from other companies. Or I might start something completely new. Whatever you decide, Dad said, I promise we'll support you. And I promise we'll never again assume we know better than you do about your own life. I smiled for the first time since the dinner argument. That would mean a lot to me. Jessica stood up and walked over to me. Michael, I'm ashamed of how I treated you. I spent 3 years condescending to you about business while you were building something I couldn't even comprehend. You were protecting your parents from what you thought was me taking advantage of them. I understand the motivation. But I was so arrogant about it. I assumed that because I had a traditional corporate job, I understood business better than you did. Traditional corporate jobs are important too. The world needs both kinds of success. But the world doesn't need people who tear down others for choosing different paths, she said. Over the next hour, we talked more openly than we had in years. I showed them the actual technology we'd built, explained how the AI algorithms worked, and walked them through the customer case studies that had convinced Tech Global to make their offer. By the time they left, something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. They were seeing me clearly for the first time in years, and I was seeing them more charitably than I had since the night they'd kicked me out. 3 months later, I bought a house in the hills overlooking the city, not because I needed to prove my success, but because I finally felt ready to put down roots somewhere permanent. The house came with a home office where I could work on my next venture, whatever that turned out to be. My family visits regularly now, and our conversations are completely different. Dad asks thoughtful questions about technology and business strategy. Mom has become fascinated by the intersection of AI and customer service. Jessica and I have started collaborating on projects where her marketing expertise complements my technical background. Most importantly, they've learned to trust that I know what I'm doing with my life, even when it doesn't look like what they expected success to look like. The night Dad kicked me out, he said he hoped someday I'd thank them for forcing me to hit rock bottom. In a strange way, he was right. Being rejected by my family for my failure business was exactly the catalyst I needed to stop caring about their approval and start focusing entirely on building something extraordinary. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to an entrepreneur is having everyone around them believe they're destined to fail. It removes all the pressure to play it safe and gives you the freedom to pursue something truly revolutionary. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who doubted you are capable of learning from their mistakes and growing into better versions of themselves. My family did exactly that, and now our relationship is stronger than it's ever been. The last text I received from Dad simply said, "Proud of you, son. Always have been, even when I was too stubborn to show it." That message was worth more than the $1.1 billion acquisition payout. Some things really are more valuable than money, like having a family that finally sees you for who you really are.